Now that the second season of The Mandalorian has come to its end, it seems readily apparent that the Disney Plus series is the unexpected future of the Star Wars universe. The rocky reception of the sequel trilogy unsurprisingly left a lot of fans wondering if Disney was about to run the Star Wars franchise into the ground. However, Mando's massive success with casual fans and Star Wars junkies alike made it seem like there was actually hope for the Star Wars expanded universe to become everything that everyone wanted it to be. But one of the most interesting aspects of The Mandalorian's success is the fact that, even in comparison to the prequel and sequel trilogies, the series somehow feels like real Star Wars when so many previous installments have felt like off-kilter imitations of the original trilogy. And given that The Mandalorian doesn't actually have much roots in the original Star Wars world, how is it that it's managed to feel like the essence of Star Wars when the actual prequels and sequels did not? Nostalgia is a difficult thing to capture and recreate in something new, as the most recent spate of Star Wars films have very painfully illustrated. With the exception of Rogue One and perhaps The Force Awakens, nearly every Star Wars movie that has been released in the last few decades has felt more like it was diminishing the original movies instead of enhancing them. But it also makes The Mandalorian's success more interesting, because it provides very clear contemporary comparisons for what seems to work in the new Star Wars universe and what doesn't. It can be incredibly difficult to capture why a movie or TV show makes people feel the way that they do, though. It may be easy to point out that the story of The Mandalorian makes more sense than the sequel trilogy, or that the characters are written better than those in the prequels, but there's that certain je ne sais quoi element of something just feeling right while something else just feels wrong. But what is it that The Mandalorian did that nailed that feeling of getting it just right? One aspect of this season that undoubtedly stuck out to most viewers is that it felt like an anthology of the Star Wars Expanded Universe's greatest hits. Every episode seemed to introduce a new character or mythological concept that got Star Wars fans seriously excited. But it also seemed to move on from those ideas pretty quickly. It almost felt like Din and Grogu were travelers who randomly intersected with important stories in the Star Wars galaxy, but didn't really become a part of those stories. Although this hit-and-run style of episodic storytelling probably left a lot of fans wanting more, that, in large part, is why the series has been so effective so far. In fact, what seems to be making The Mandalorian feel like the most Star Wars thing since Star Wars is just that. It's a series that is going out of its way to acknowledge the mythology of the world that it occupies, as well as bringing in characters that the audience all desperately wants to see. But it's not trying to expand upon or alter those characters or that mythology in any way. And this season did this with nearly every significant Star Wars universe character that was introduced. Characters like bo-katan, Ahsoka Tano, and Luke Skywalker all played significant roles in moving the story along, but that is solely what they were there for. It didn't feel like they were stifling the narrative or eclipsing the story of Din and Grogu, and most importantly, it didn't feel like the show was trying to force them in where they didn't belong. They showed up, offered enough breadcrumbs to keep fans interested, and they played the roles that everyone had always wanted to see them play without being shoehorned into the narrative unnaturally. In contrast to something like the sequel trilogy, it's easy to see why The Mandalorian succeeded where the latest movies have failed. Nostalgia is obviously something that's best used as inspiration sparingly, because once the image that fans have had in their minds for decades is being altered for the sake of connecting a new story to an old one, it immediately begins to feel forced and makes both the contemporary storyline and the nostalgic references feel like puzzle pieces that don't quite fit together. Clearly, doing something like making the protagonist and antagonist of the main storyline a Palpatine and a Skywalker, and bringing an ancient villain back from the dead, makes it feel like the franchise is trying to beat a literal and metaphorical dead horse. And by significantly adding on to the earlier storyline, both the old story and new story feel diminished. But in relative comparison, it's easy to see why The Mandalorian finally feels like Star Wars Reborn, because it's giving fans all of the references and cameos that they dream of seeing, but it does nothing to change its iconic characters or mythology. Nor does it try to expand upon the mythology to the point where it sort of loses the magic that it once held, like the prequels did by overly explaining the Force with midi-chlorian counts. Another aspect of The Mandalorian that really worked in its favor was that it's a series that caters to any level of Star Wars fan, and it utilized the available cast of characters and lore to fill roles that needed to be filled within the story anyway. If the narrative needs a Mandalorian to meet a future Jedi, why not make a character like Grogu, who will be immediately identifiable to even the most casual of fans, in addition to being a vital character in his own right? If Din and Grogu are looking for Jedi, then why not throw in characters like Luke Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano? But what makes it work even more effectively is that the audience doesn't actually need to be familiar with all of this lore in order for it to be entertaining. Someone who doesn't know who bo-katan Kryze is can still be intrigued by a badass warrior princess who is looking for her super cool lightsaber. And someone doesn't have to be extensively familiar with the Star Wars universe and know the entire history of the Darksaber to know that it's a cool looking weapon and that its uniqueness likely denotes some level of importance within the overall narrative. Interestingly, someone with no base level knowledge of Star Wars could start watching The Mandalorian and still be interested in the story and find most of these characters compelling. Which again, seems to stem from the fact that while they're iconic characters in the Star Wars universe in their own right, they aren't being shoved into the storyline just for the sake of appealing to Star Wars fans. They're all there to actually do something that is relevant to the narrative, and once that relevance has come to its conclusion, they don't stick around unnecessarily. But the audience of Star Wars is broad and has different layers of depth. There are casual fans that will pick up on 30% of the references and super fans who will pick up on 90% of them. But they can both equally enjoy the story because all of these references actually serve a purpose within the narrative. So it would seem after years of trying and billions of dollars worth of investment, The Mandalorian has finally found the sweet spot of continuing the Star Wars universe. It's about creating a story that works as a standalone piece, and that incorporates earlier Star Wars lore when it's actually necessary, but that doesn't attempt to build its narrative solely around previously established canon. And that most importantly, doesn't go out of its way to just tell the same story again with a slightly different cast of characters who, it turns out, are even closer to the characters that they replaced than it first seemed. It's about ensuring that the memorable and fully established characters remain in character, and it's far more important to maintain that character continuity and write a character out of the story if needs be, instead of altering established characters in order to keep them in the narrative. If the characters within the story can have an organic reason for interacting with the previously established characters, then it can be a thrilling moment for fans. But if the narrative has to create excuses in order to bring characters together, then it's going to feel forced and have the opposite effect on the audience that it's meant to. And of course, most importantly, it's about building a new story within the foundation of a specific fictional universe, but it's not about relying on that universe to tell the story on its own. And it's certainly not about relying on stories that have been told before or reimagining them and telling them again. And if The Mandalorian and the larger Disney Star Wars universe can actually maintain that balance, it looks like it could become the live-action expanded universe that fans have been dreaming of for decades.